new CBS reality documentary, The Murder That Changed Britain, will look at the killing of Rachel Nicholl, who was brutally murdered in broad daylight in 1992. The 90-minute one-off special will hear from Colin Stagg, the man wrongly jailed for the murder of Rachel, and Professor Paul Britton, who Colin blamed for his arrest. Viewers will also hear the account of retired Metropolitan Police Commander, Gary Copson, who reflects back on the investigation and his involvement. Rachel was killed on July 15, 1992 in front of her 2-year-old son on Wimbledon Common. In August 1993, Colin Stagg was arrested, spent 13 months in custody, and endured more than a decade of speculation that he was Rachel's killer before the real culprit, Robert Napper, was brought to justice. For 3 decades, the man who has squarely shouldered the blame for the catastrophic failure was the country's leading forensic psychologist, Professor Britton. It was Professor Britton's criminal profile of the killer at the time and an eyewitness that later convinced police that Colin was their man. However, in the new documentary, Professor Britton and Colin come face to face to speak about the Rachel Nicholl murder 30 years on. In an exclusive interview with Express.co.uk, retired police commander, Gary has also reflected on the investigation, sharing his stance on how the case unfolded and how Colin Stagg was wrongly accused. Gary explained while he was not part of the investigating team on the case, he did observe what was going on within the investigation. The ex-police chief went on to add that his job at the time was to introduce Professor Britton to the investigating officers, describing it as an interpreter role. The former police commander said, "It was of concern to me that Colin Stagg was identified with such certainty as the first suspect. There were aspects of the investigation that concerned me at the time, and then after Colin Stagg was exonerated at the Central Criminal Court. The commission had set up an investigation into what had gone wrong, and I was one of 4 officers who investigated what had gone wrong. And looking back then, just from a couple of years' distance, there were a lot of things that might have been done very differently. But I was not in an authoritative position where I could tell the officers what to do." Gary admitted at the time, police did have other credible suspects, but claimed they were ignored. "The single focus was on Colin Stagg," he added. "But there were, it turned out, some other extremely credible suspects who were ignored because the team was so sure that Colin Stagg was the murderer. My recollection is that Colin Stagg did identify himself by having knowledge that he shouldn't have had, and that did bring him to attention. His account for that was that the officer on the cordon at Wimbledon Common had told him these things, and he then repeated them in his local parade of shops later that day. At the time, police decided to send a police officer undercover to try and gather evidence against Colin. During the investigation, they uncovered a secret letter Colin had written to someone on a dating site. There were aspects that were disturbing, shall we say," Gary recalled. "There were sexual fantasies and they were quite dark, and it was enough to make the police officers investigating the case, and it was enough to influence Paul Britton, the psychologist." Speaking about the undercover operation, Gary added, "Now the way in which they chose to do that by getting an undercover police officer to say that she had found this letter while babysitting at a friend's house and it sexually excited her. That was the decision of the investigating officers. It was a very unusual and rare example of undercover work, but given the nature of that letter, which of course I did read at the time, it wasn't terribly outlandish." Despite his concerns about there not being enough evidence, Gary said, So Paul Britton responded to requests from the police for help, and while I wished at the time, that he said, "No, we've done that test and it was not met, so you should discard him as a suspect." He listened to the continued pleas to continue to the next stage of the operation, and his natural inclination to help took him there. However, despite being arrested and charged with the murder of Rachel, Colin was eventually cleared by a judge who decided not to take the case to trial, and he was acquitted. The Murder That Changed Britain will premiere on CBS Reality on Wednesday at 10 p.m.